Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower. In the 1940s, way up in the northeast of Asia, in the occupied zone, a civilian man was accosted by four occupation soldiers who were walking around behaving very churlishly with the helpless civilians around them. He protested, and these four soldiers dragged him off to an out-of-the-way bridge for an educational beatdown. What they did not know was that this man was a master of two traditional martial arts, and they were the ones about to get the education. Now, here's the interesting thing. Although our self-defender was well-versed in traditional martial arts, what happened next did not look like you would think martial arts would look like. Rather, it looked like a chaotic gutter beatdown. The way he recounted the story later, bad guy number one swung at him from the front, and he, the defender, blocked with his left and then with his right foot, boom, launched a knockout kick right into the bad guy's badoobies. Okay, so far so good. Scratch one bad guy and +1 for some pretty traditional looking martial arts. Behind him, he felt bad guy number two approaching, and he surmised that the guy wasn't coming to give him flowers and chocolates. And so he whipped around behind him, throwing out his hand in a sort of like a knife hand gesture. And sure enough, boom, it knocked away an arm that the other dude behind him was either punching or grabbing with. And then right away, our guy grabbed the arm and whoosh, tossed the guy in one of those one-point judo-looking throws off the bridge into the stream below. Okay, pretty cool. And yeah, it sounds worthy of a Jackie Chan movie even. Now, it sounds like the affray was degenerating into more of a furball, though. Bad guy number three got a headbutt in the face that knocked him out cold. Bad guy number four must have been up at very close quarters now, trying to grab on to our self-defender, when our self-defender said he fell back on the oldest, most reliable technique he had, something that he'd been using since he was in middle school. As he wrote later in his autobiography, I disposed of the last one by squeezing his balls with full force. And he added, ever since my school days, I was known by my friends as the master ball grabber. Friends, this story is funny, but it is full of lessons for us. A few episodes ago, I was talking about the Anglo-Chinese gutter fighting system of one W.E. Fairbairn, late of the Shanghai Municipal Police during the warlord era, and later of the British Army, who then was loaned out further to the American OSS, the precursor to the CIA. And I promised you that I would talk to you about what I believe to be the best book about Fairbairn's system. I'm here to review it today. It's Dmitry Samoilov's The Mind is the Final Weapon, a scientific view of the Fairbairn system. As I said before, it is the best damn book I've ever seen on Anglo-Chinese gutter fighting and W.E. Fairbairn. And that includes Fairbairn's own books. Fairbairn wrote several books, and he even published them in the civilian press, but they were like simple pamphlets for the end user. Fairbairn himself was a master gutter fighter and systematizer and trainer for gutter fighting. However, he was a man of action. He was not gifted with the written word. And he didn't have to be. That wasn't part of his job. The British and American military establishments created camps of soldiers and spies who would be sent for intensive, immersive programs with him. So Fairbairn didn't have to commit this to writing. He just had his thoughts, and then those informed the system that he designed, and other people would get put through this boot camp that he had devised. He never did record like the developer notes for how exactly he chose and sifted the various pieces, parts, and assembled them in exactly the way he did. However, that is what we have in Dmitry Samoilov's book. Samoilov has reconstructed the evolution of Fairbairn's system from documents, films, manuals, manuscripts, memoirs, and interviews. And then he's filled in the remaining substantial blank spaces with context from his own extremely interesting career as a scientist who creates military training programs, whose job is to figure out how you best train people to operate complicated systems like man-pads, man-portable air defense missiles, when they're under extreme stress. And I would imagine that whenever a person has cause to fire a rocket at a fighter aircraft, that is probably an emotionally significant experience. Now, this is going to be an unusual book review in a couple of ways. First is that if you look, you'll notice that I am the editor of the book, and usually you don't review a book that you yourself helped to publish. But this is kind of a special case because I reviewed this book before I ever translated it. You see, a year ago, I stumbled across this book in its Russian original, and then it spun my top so much that I reviewed it for a blog that I kept in those days. And then it still was blowing my mind so much that I decided I would try to track down the author on the Russian version of LinkedIn. And amazingly, it worked. And I said, dude, you have to publish this in English. And he agreed that it sounded like a good idea. But friends, translating a book is a huge pain in the butt, and it's very expensive to do, unless it's a labor of love. So that is what it became. Luckily, I was an insomniac with a 2-year-old infant, and I wasn't sleeping anyway. And so I said to Dmitry Samoilov, the author, look, my Russian sucks, but if I'm the best you got, let me try to translate this thing. And Dmitry's English is very, very, very good. And so he acted as my polisher. So we agreed I would translate the book with his oversight and edit it and put it out in English so that it could get a broader circulation. The book was just much too good to only exist in one language. And the proceeds, if there are any, will go to a children's charity. So the first reason that it's not weird in this case that I'm reviewing a book that I'm the editor of is that I actually wrote the review before I ever got involved with publishing it. And second, the proceeds are going to a kids charity. So even if this review does spur you to buy the book, and I hope it will, this does not profit me. So what was so amazing about this book that it leaped out at me? It was the diagrams of Fairbairn's techniques, like the famous chin jab and the cradle blow. But it wasn't what the diagrams showed. It's where they were. Namely, the diagrams were buried deep in the middle of this book, under 200 pages of Russian text. So I wanted to know, what does this author have to say that's so important that it takes 200 pages of preparation before you get to the first chin jab? See, in Fairbairn's own books, usually on page 1 of the book, you'll get like simple instructions for the edge of hand blow. And then on the next page, you'll get like diagrams and a few pro tips. But it's not exactly Virgil's Aeneid. And even with my extremely crude Russian, I could tell from the text that whatever was happening in those first 200 pages was deep. So I was sitting there nap-trapped under a sleeping 2-month-old anyway, squinting at this small Russian text, wondering what the hell is there to say about Fairbairn throat-chopping people that takes 200 pages of scholarly Russian to get across with footnotes. And I figured, well, since I'm not going anywhere anyway until this guy gets up, I might as well scrape the rust off all the Russian grammar I can remember and try to find out. And what I found there was what I believe to be the best book of its genre. What genre is that? Like the self-protection, street defense, combatives genre. A lot of good books are available about this now. And it now increasingly, I think they've taken a page out of the firearms, CCW community, and law enforcement, defensive tactics, force on force training. And those kind of authors have tried to get very serious about situational awareness, avoidance, legal considerations and laws of self-defense, the adrenaline effect on people's motor skills and their perceptions. All the many good books in this genre take account of those things now. It's just that this book does it better, way better than any of those can because of who Samoilov is. In his day job, he's a scientist of extreme stress and what it does to people's skill performance and how you use training routines to try to maximize what they can do during a significant emotional event. So when Samoilov writes a book like this, the chapters on, say, situational awareness and the psychophysiology of stress are going to be masterpieces, where some other book might say, I was a street cop in Detroit for 30 years, and I would always do X and Y, which is great. Samoilov's version of that will be something like, a lot of old school street cops say you should do X. And in fact, both Miyamoto Musashi and William Fairbairn wrote something similar. Then, in 2004, it was tested and corroborated by a group of researchers who took 30 volunteer police officers and injected mace directly into their nostrils, and then tested their handgun proficiency while they were screaming, or something like that. And that applies to all these breakthrough topics like situational awareness, avoidance, the sociology of violence, the psychophysiology of extreme stress, the legal fallout of an incident like this, and the laws of self-defense. And also, it takes very seriously the implications of limited training time, because nobody knows better than Samoilov that it takes a very long time to inculcate skills that will be stress-proofed, and he knows just how far those limits can be pushed. And so you can see Samoilov's book as like a lot of A/B testing of various lore. There's a lot of substance. He takes a lot of the hoary chestnuts, like situational awareness is super important. And he takes them to a level of detail that just isn't possible with other folks. And he practically avalanches you with concrete steps that you can take, like drills and disciplines for improving your peripheral vision and so on. Ditto too for old chestnuts like the real weapon is the mind. Everything else is just an appendage. Lots of people say that enough to make me think that it really is true. But when Samoilov says it, then he follows it with 8 chapters, almost 100 pages of exactly what you should do about that fact and to get better at situational awareness. So in this respect, Samoilov is kind of like Fairbairn himself. He has a job that puts him in a position to get lots of data from the field about what he's writing about, and then refine and iterate. Also, nowadays, anybody who's a trainer in anything tactical pays at least lip service to the OODA loop. Now, sometimes they stop at platitudes, sometimes they have quite a bit more to offer about it, but Samoilov is unique in this field. He has 2 PhDs in this stuff, and his career involves developing video games that affect whether someone gets killed. So in his book, you can scarcely go 10 pages without referring back to the OODA loop and then getting concrete recommendations like, and therefore do X and not Y. Samoilov points out that if you look under the hood of Fairbairn's system and you kind of recreate his thought process as he put it together, you'll notice that as much as possible, he made sure that his attacks didn't just do damage to the enemy, but they also either degraded his observation and orientation and or unbalanced him and or damaged him. So for example, Fairbairn gravitates tremendously to eye attacks, which ruin the enemy's observation and orientation and balance. He goes for lots of head and neck attacks. Those are the preference. Those won't just hurt him and maybe render him unconscious, but they can also disequilibrate him and break his posture. Also, lots of groin attacks. As I keep joking, Fairbairn loves to seize the testicles. Now, he uses this with caution. There's some footnotes about that. That's not Fairbairn's first go-to attack. But there are times when the target is wide open, and not only does it hurt a lot, but it also disequilibrates the bad guy. If you're a reader of really good books in this field, like those of Rory Miller, you'll recognize lots of themes that Samoilov will take further than you've seen before. So, for example, Rory Miller introduced the concept of the decision stick. This was a play on the idea of the decision tree, where you have a bunch of branching options. And Miller made the point that when you're in an emergency, you want fewer options. You want to make fewer decisions because every decision takes time and adds cognitive load. So Miller recommended that you pare away decisions in advance, and you would very judiciously choose one well-drilled go-to response that would cover a broad range of contingencies, and then practice the crap out of that. So that when you suddenly had to respond to something unexpected, instead of having to navigate a decision tree, you would have a decision stick. The decision would already be made, and you could just go. That is a very useful observation. Samoilov, however, then follows it up with half a doctoral dissertation that carries it further and further and gives you its practical implications. A little bit later, we'll come back to this issue of parsimonious, judicious choice of techniques, because for me, that's where the real nerd fun is. But first, Samoilov has a whole bunch of other post-grad level conclusions to draw from these pretty well-known facts about the psychophysiology of stress. You know, if you've ever taken like a basic CCW course before, You know that people under life-threatening conditions have adrenaline effects that will cause you to have auditory exclusion, like you don't hear things the way you normally would. You get tunnel vision on whatever you perceive to be the threat, and sometimes you can be wrong about that. That's how Pat Tillman died. And famously, you lose fine motor skills and you end up doing best at gross motor movement. Samoilov actually has a bunch of things to say about that, to add to that I've still never heard of before, like the difference between complex and fine motor skills, and the way that gross motor skills will actually get better the higher your heart rate goes. And that's something that I actually didn't know. Anyway, if you've been to like a basic CCW class before, you've had like the eighth grade level of this stuff. And me, I kind of thought that it ended there, but nope. Samoilov has a lot more to say about this. He really takes you to grad school. One thing is that past experience counts for a lot. You'll have some voluntary control over how you respond to stress up to a certain level of terror. But after that point, you will go on true autopilot, and your brain will hijack your voluntary decision making, and you will automatically default to whatever response worked best for your brain in the past, in whatever situation it believes was closest to this one. And sometimes that can be disastrous if your brain chooses the wrong analogy. Hence, we get cases of like scuba divers who are in severe distress and their panicked brains force them to rip out their regulators underwater because their brains have gotten hold of this idea that their real problem is a wet obstruction over their breathing. And so it becomes diabolically obsessed with like getting the regulator out of your mouth. And from that fact, Samoilov then draws a bunch of concrete takeaways of the do X, don't do Y variety. Another corollary to all this that Samoilov points to is that on one hand, you can partially ameliorate your response to emergencies through experience that can help to stress inoculate you. However, he says, that stress proofing is very situation specific. It turns out that you can be stress inoculated for one thing, like a machine gun battle, but that won't necessarily carry over to public speaking or cage fighting. So again, from this lesson, he takes a bunch of do X, don't do Y conclusions. I'm hammering this home, like the concrete conclusions, because I want to emphasize that he doesn't leave you hanging out in a world of theory, persuaded of a bunch of new like pedagogic and didactic philosophies without telling you how to operationalize them. No. Samoilov is all about operationalizing things. He constantly reminds me in his book of this really cool professor and IDF intel officer whose favorite saying was, "There's nothing more practical than a good theory." I think if and when we interview Samoilov here, we probably will get him to say something like that. Another saying that I think he'll agree with is this famous Chinese kung fu saying, 一胆二力三功夫, which means the first thing is attitude, then comes strength, power. Skill is third. That's a very Fairbairnian thing to say, and I think Samoilov would sign on. The thrust of it is that according to Fairbairn and Samoilov and the anonymous kung fu saying maker, in a fight for a person's life, it's moxie and aggression and morale and the will to win and the confidence to win that is going to matter the most. After that, it sure helps to have a whole lot of explosive power in crazy monkey setting. And that is why Samoilov has a whole section of the book on physical training. We'll come to that in a moment. Third, according to this saying, is skill. Skill is important, it's helpful, it can be a great equalizer, but Fairbairn and Samoilov are realists. They're sending a message that's kind of opposite to the sort of strip mall dough that prevailed in my young and largely stupid martial arts training. We were sold this superhero ego-boosting fantasy that with the right skills, you could overcome any foe, regardless of size, and use his own strength against him. Don't get me wrong, Samoilov and Fairbairn both teach that the smaller person may yet prevail, but it will be despite their smaller stature and their feebler strength. For those people, the good news is that ultimately the mind is the final weapon, and having some skills can go a long way to putting whatever strength and power a person does have into effect. Proceeding now to martial geekery, what I think is Samoilov's greatest value add And just the most geek-tastically riveting thing is watching him reconstruct Fairbairn's thought process. As I mentioned, Fairbairn created a very large, well-considered system, both of fighting and of training to use that system of fighting. And it looks outwardly crude, but I would say it's what you could call calculated crudity. To use an overworked metaphor, it's like a Kalashnikov rifle in that respect. Because it's durable and not finicky and has wide tolerances, it's easy to take the impression that it was just created in a slapdash, don't care, good enough for government socialist work way. Not true. If you know anything about Kalashnikov's rifle, you know that it was the result of a long period of iteration. It may look like a random pile of garbage, but it is not. It's as ingeniously assembled a system as, say, a Swiss clock. It just goes a very long way to applying like high concept engineering so that the parts don't need to be more complicated, more expensive, and more precise than they need to be to get the desired effect. And this is crucial for the Fairbairn analogy. It's also designed so that it will do the maximum work with the minimum maintenance and upkeep. Okay, so Samoilov's belief about Fairbairn's system is that it's exactly that calculated. Just like the Kalashnikov, it may look sloppy in operation, but it is an ingenious slop. The parts that are there are all there for very, very specific reasons, and they are assembled in a true system. That is, in Greek, sus histanai. The pieces are erected together, fit together just as neatly and carefully as the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Nothing in there is random, even if it looks that way. This is Samoilov's belief. And he goes through, and I believe he shows very convincingly that even people who have celebrated Fairbairn's legacy, taught it and promulgated it, many of those fans still don't understand that it's more than a set of techniques. There's a whole lot of high concept design happening under the hood. And just because it's so user-friendly that the user doesn't have to think very hard to operate it, doesn't mean that a lot of really world-class engineering didn't go into making it so. Now, once again, because Fairbairn didn't like leave a diary where he said, "Dear diary, today I decided to teach the sidekick differently." Because Fairbairn didn't leave those sorts of records of his thought process, because he just left some syllabi, some very lapidary manuals, that is, they're very abbreviated. He, as the designer and engineer and maintainer of this training system, didn't commit all his thoughts to paper before he died. And so Samoilov goes back through and he tries to reconstruct a lot of this. Samoilov, of course, is uniquely qualified to do this because he does similar kind of work. He just does it with like anti-aircraft weapons and stuff. But the principles are the same. What are those principles? Well, in Fairbairn's case, the design specs are these. Fairbairn explicitly was looking to create a system that would work for people who possibly were surprised, possibly by many people, possibly approaching from behind or the side, possibly with weapons when the good guy wouldn't have one. And also, he took into account that people might have to use the system while they were like sitting down, maybe even lying down. This would be like if you're sitting on a train through Belgium with a briefcase full of false identification on your way to meet with the French resistance, and then the Gestapo comes and claps you on the shoulder and says, "Come with me." You're going to end up needing to fight the Gestapo while you're sitting on this moving train. Similarly, the system needed to work if it were pressed into service in a dark place, on a stairwell, on ice during the French winter, in a cellar, if the person perhaps was even blindfolded, who knows? And finally, the trainee would certainly want to have weapons available, but probably wouldn't have a real weapon. So they needed to be trained to apply the system with whatever objects they could bring to hand. A makeshift stabbing implement, a makeshift club. Fairbairn was very interested in umbrellas, for example. He thought, if you can't have a billy club, actually an umbrella is not half bad. That sounds ridiculous to me, but when you read his book on the use of sticks, You'll see what I mean. And then a further design requirement that Samoylov really hammers home a lot is that Fairbairn's system was made to have as few moving parts as possible. And he points out that if you study the history of Fairbairn's system from, say, the 20s and his Shanghai period to the 30s and then the 40s and the wartime years, and possibly even later when he was teaching colonial police in places like Cyprus, what you see is a steady winnowing of techniques out of Fairbairn's stuff, where he finds that he can make one adapted technique do the work of two before. Kind of like the Kalashnikov has a dust cover that also functions as the safety. That's great. You get two functions for one part. In the case of the Kalashnikov, that's one less thing that can be broken or go missing. In the case of Fairbairn's system, it's one less technique that you have to train. Because, and this is the final design specification, the system had to be learnable in a very short period, couple of weeks of full-time training, often much less. Sometimes Fairbairn would get a trainee and be told, like, look, we're dropping this lady into France tonight. You've got 6 hours to teach her as much as you can. And Fairbairn, being a very, very systematic thinker, he already knew exactly what the priorities were. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you can only teach one move, it's going to be the edge of hand. If you can teach two moves, it's going to be the edge of hand and the chin jab. If you can teach three moves, ba-doop, 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 ba-doop. So at every corner of this design project, he's constantly triaging to minimize learning and maintaining time. Because, as Fairbairn points out, even when you learn skills, they decay unless you can maintain them. And if you minimize the number of movements, that's great. That's less training time, less time and effort required to maintain them. And it makes your own cognitive process smoother when you have to observe, orient, decide, and act. Now, Samoylov points out, it's not like the Fairbairn system is the only system of hand-to-hand combat in the world that meets all these design specifications. There are lots of fighting systems in the world, and the human race is very smart and resourceful. Other ones have been invented before. But Samoylov points out, there are very, very few that actually fit all of those criteria. He doesn't name names exactly about what they are, but I've got my suspicions. And if we do lure him here to our channel to interview him, we'll see if we can get him to be specific. But in the case of the Fairbairn system, we at least have a contender that can plausibly claim to be not just very well designed, but also have been put through a bunch of road testing and field testing where reports would come back from the agents in the field. And then, as we can see from Fairbairn's own curricular notes, he would decide, like, it's not working so well having people kick knees, turning their foot to the outside. So from now on, we're just going to hold the foot vertical, things like that. It's been through a lot of developmental reps. And I would also add that in Fairbairn's case, it's nice because there hasn't elapsed a whole lot of historical time since World War II for mythologization to happen. Just to kind of put some of my cards on the table, there are definitely systems of melee combat in southern China that had all kinds of practical experience underlying them. However, well over 100 years and a communist regime has covered over much of that experience. And we don't really know how much mythologization and drift has occurred in the meantime. I think you could probably say much the same thing about many of the Japanese arts, including even some of the Koryu arts, the old school arts that supposedly were adapted purely for combat and not for personal development. So to summarize, Samoylov isn't saying Fairbairn is the one true way. He is the one holy Catholic and apostolic close combat system. But from our standpoint in history, we may very well have better access to a full understanding of that system and how to apply it in the case of Fairbairn than we do in many of the other historical contenders. Certainly, based on the field reports that came back from the agents and soldiers who used this in the war, what we got in the Fairbairn system, when it's properly taught and applied, is a kind of Kalashnikov. You can think of World War II as being like one of those really cool YouTube stress tests where they take a Kalashnikov and then first they bathe it in mud and it still runs, and then they stuff Twinkies into the ejection port, but that big overgassed Kalashnikov op rod with a ton of momentum behind it just chunk, 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 eats through the Twinkies and spits them out the ejection port because it's like the size of a garage door. And when you watch that Kalashnikov firing on full auto and high def super slow mo, to me the action looks so floppy and sloppy, like it might shake itself apart. It's got all the finesse of like a coal cart trundling down a track into a Dickensian coal mine. But damn it, it turns out Mikhail Kalashnikov zeroed in on the awesome zone with all those specs and tolerances over many years of iterations. And darn it, if it just doesn't work really well. So even though I've spent all this time talking about how, according to Samoylov, the techniques in Fairbairn's system are really kind of the least important thing, darn it, the old strip mall karate geek in me still thinks that they're really cool. And so I have to tell you about them. Fairbairn's parsimonious choice of techniques and the ruthless winnowing that he conducted with them really stands out when you keep in mind Fairbairn's background. We know that he had a second degree in judo, which, doesn't make him one of the top men. But keep in mind, this is 1920s and 30s judo in Shanghai, very close to the mothership at the Kodokan in Japan, when judo was not yet a completely genteel sporting enterprise. That story that I told you at the beginning of the man who whooped ass on 4 occupation soldiers, who was that? That was the greatest judoka who ever lived, Masahiko Kimura. He was at least a 6th dan in judo at that time, maybe 7th already. He was also training in Gojuryu with no less than Mas Oyama of Kyokushinkai fame. Think George St. Pierre. Damn it, I think he was the best Japanese martial artist of his generation. But you'll notice that in application against those 4 GIs, what he did could have come directly out of the Fairbairn playbook. Even that seoi nage, that 1-point shoulder throw, that used to be in Fairbairn's syllabus back in his cop days. But this brings me to my point now. Even with Fairbairn's background in judo and a lot of training in jujutsu and Southern Chinese Kung Fu, and arguably in Ba Guazhang, we're not sure about that. Even with all that training in classical martial arts, Fairbairn deliberately left out most of these cool things that he could do because he was focusing on minimalism. What was left then? Samoylov will give you the details, but basically, for somebody surprising you from the front, there was one go-to attack. At various points, he referred to this as the tiger claw or the chin jab. For a surprise attack coming from any other point of the compass, it was this famous edge of hand blow. Famously, Fairbairn taught this with the thumb out, which seems crazy, but I think I figured it out. The muscle that pulls the thumb in to keep it close to the hand, the way most people teach a knife hand blow, is the adductor pollicis. And it has the secondary effect of acting as an antagonist on elbow extension. Since Fairbairn wanted the edge of hand blow to be sweeping and swinging, which is not the same as snapping, swinging like an axe, he wanted the elbow to be as disinhibited as possible. I think that really is the main reason for wanting the thumb out. In any case, that was Fairbairn's immediate go-to for any attack that came unexpectedly from anywhere except in front of you. And you'll notice, actually, that in the story of Kimura and the 4 GIs, when bad guy number 2 approaches him from the back, that's exactly what Kimura did. So they're your main go-tos. And Fairbairn thought the edge of hand was so important that if he had that agent who was being parachuted into Belgium in a few hours and only had time to learn one thing, that one thing was going to be the edge of hand blow, because it was so versatile, he thought. And because probably the Nazis wouldn't have the courtesy to attack the agent from the front, they would probably get her from the sides or behind. So for Fairbairn, those 2 attacks, the chin jab or tiger claw and the edge of hand, are doing the lion's share of the work, but he has some other contingency things too. If the high line is blocked, he's got 3 kicks for you. Hit the groin if you can, hit the knees if you must. If nothing else will do, try to hit the top of the foot. And while you're at it, he points out, Whenever you advance, which is practically the only step that Fairbairn knows, whenever you advance on the enemy, you're encouraged to try to step on his feet. I think this also is ingenious minimalist design engineering. Fairbairn doesn't confuse the trainee with footwork, but he does build it into some places. And when he tells people, try to step on Jerry's feet as you're chasing across the room, beating the tar out of him, that actually does two things. It gets Tommy, the good guy, first constantly advancing on Jerry. As Jerry is knocked back and his feet go with him, well, Tommy keeps stomping forward. The other thing is that if Tommy gets lucky and he pins one of Jerry's feet to the floor when he belts him with a tiger claw or a chin jab, well, that just might break Jerry's ankle when he falls to the floor. Everyone wins, and England is saved. There are several other movements that are reserved for various contingencies, including the famous seizing of the testicles. Fairbairn thinks that in a lot of cases, if you get grabbed, which you really do not want to be, because it's easy to get dogpiled, but if you do get grabbed, you can solve a lot of problems with thumbs in eyes or fingers ripping off inno. So the way Samoilov presents what he calls the arsenal of Fairbairn's techniques, of which there are roughly 12, the way he puts it together, you can see, and I'm persuaded by this, that Fairbairn is not offering you choices, he's offering you an algorithm. It's the most stripped down possible algorithm. All the worst and likeliest contingencies have an immediate solution which the trainee can execute now, now, now. And as he quotes General Patton saying, a good enough plan executed violently right away is much better than a perfect plan executed next week. There's also a lot of stuff in the way Samoilov reconstructs that arsenal that is subtly but decisively different from the way I've seen these techniques taught by almost any other Fairbairn/combatives type teacher before. And Samoilov has his reasons. Some of them he states explicitly in the book. Others maybe we can wheedle out from him on the air if he'll come and do an interview. But he finds subtleties, even in those very gross motor techniques, that you may think you know inside and out. Give Samoilov's instructions on those a shot, and you may find that some of them are revolutionized. I had that kind of like major epiphanic experience with probably 3 or 4 of them. Now you see why I decided to devote months of my life to translating this book. But I, for one, was persuaded that the book is just that damn good. And once again, in saying so, I'm not self-dealing, I'm not selling out, I'm not shilling my own product because this money is just going to end up going to orphans in Mexico or something. An example of the kind of technique that Fairbairn excludes, even though it's a really great technique, would be something like an overhand right. I've seen people hit with overhand rights that weren't even thrown with evil intention, but still it turned them like practically into a cloud of dust because it just came over the top and almost vaporized them. An overhand right is a fearsome weapon. The problem is that it's distance sensitive. It requires setup. This is why boxing matches don't just involve dudes flailing with right hand overhand leads. So following Fairbairn's thought process, an overhand right is a great shot for a boxer who's maybe a little bit on the taller side and finds that he has some affinity with it and he can work it into his game plan because he's a dedicated athlete for whom training time is an avocation and to some extent an end in itself. And also there aren't lethal consequences to not being able to land it just right. For Fairbairn's purposes, if you've only got room in your toolbox for 10 or 12 tools, something like an overhand right just isn't gonna fit. It's too specific. Personally, it amazed me that grabbing the testicles made the cut. Maybe it's because I'm a modern person and everyone where I live pretty much wears jeans or slacks that fit like those. And I mean, although I've never tried to, never mind. Grabbing groins has not been part of my experience. But by golly, it turns out that it has a long and very impressive martial heritage. Not only did Kimura pull it off against 4 guys, but no less than Gichin Funakoshi, one of the introducers of karate to Japan, did. Now, Funakoshi had this moment in his 70s when he was assaulted in a train station by a man who like grabbed Funakoshi's umbrella away from him, and then swung the hard end at Funakoshi's head. Funakoshi was in his 70s, and he was not like a fighting karate guy. He was considered a sort of ambassador for the art, and he was the principal person in turning this into a physical and spiritual education enterprise for Japanese school kids. And he looks like he deliberately defanged a lot of karate. There were Okinawans of his generation who were renowned fighting karate guys, people like Chojun Miyagi of Goju fame. But Funakoshi, he was a professor. Like, he was the me of the karate world. But darn it, if on this occasion, good old Funakoshi, the septuagenarian who gets surprised in a train station, just ducks this swinging umbrella. And then what does he do while he's down there? But just grab a fistful of kintama. And good night. End of altercation. He held the dude there by his member until the police came and took him away. Also, if you have the courage to search on YouTube for groin grab or testicle grab, don't do that yet. Wait till the end of this video. But if you don't mind what that'll do to your search history, you will see some things. Turns out, maybe it really is one of the top 12 moves that you could put into a system like this. I think Fairbairn used it because even though he was trying to keep out of like nose-to-nose grappling situations, it was gonna happen. And so he had things like headbutts, a knee, biting and finger breaking opportunistically, and the groin grab in there as quick and easy ways to solve a lot of problems that didn't involve doing a bunch of complicated Aikido Jiu-Jitsu training for years. I'm running crazy long at this point, and I actually purposely skipped the whole first third of the book on mindset because it's kind of ghoulish stuff, and this is a family program. You can read that in the book, but it's clear from that Fairbairn and Samoilov know what they're talking about. On the subject of improvised weapons, whoa, Samoilov nailed it. He nailed it. You will never look at household objects again, and you will understand, like with this great light bulb that descends from the heavens through parted clouds, you will understand that Fairbairn definitely chose the hand techniques that he did because each one is meant to have a found object put into it and then used in the very same way. Except now it's much worse because you have a fistful of ashtray or scissors or something. Moving right along, Samoilov also has a big chapter on strength training because, as the saying goes, moxie and guts come first, then comes strength, then comes skill. Samoilov recommends strength training of a different kind than I would do, but then again, I don't have any particular knowledge about strength training specifically for hand-to-hand combat. But two big takeaways from the strength training chapter that I took with me, despite my different philosophy of training, was Samoilov did influence me to train speed strength more. The other thing is that he prompted me to strengthen my thumbs. He made a really good point about this, and this was something that Fairbairn's teaching partner, Eric Sykes of Sykes Fairbairn Commando Dagger fame, Sykes was very insistent that his trainees train their grip, and he said the weak link in the grip for most men is their thumbs. If you're used to carrying like bags, rocks, barbells, kettlebells, that kind of thing, you probably have much more strength in your fingers than you do in the thumb. And after all, a pinch grip is the sum of these two kinds of strength. It's only as strong as your thumb can be. So Samoilov gives you some of Sykes's tricks for bringing the thumb up to scratch as fast as possible. And these are things that you can do in your car, and they're kind of cool. Instead of sitting in traffic, you feel like you're doing something like deadly and important. The last great thing that I'll mention about Samoilov's book is that he's very good about baking into almost every page an awareness that these altercations don't happen in isolation. In the situational awareness stuff, he pays very close attention to the fact that any hands-on altercation that you have has red flags that the victim missed and a causality path where they could have exited if they had had the correct awareness. In addition to that, he points out these altercations also have legal aftermath. And this is the kind of thing that now is absolutely standard in, say, CCW classes. Samoilov is very clued into that, and he's always emphasizing that the moment you begin to train, you need to be training with the fact of legal aftermath in mind. And you have to do it with an awareness of the laws of self-defense and the judicial process in your area. You'll need to account for your actions to the police, and so you better have been legally in the right with everything that you did up to that point, and you'd better be able to articulate why what you did was lawful and correct and necessary, and so on and so on. I'll only say that because Samoilov lives in the Russian Federation and he was writing in Russian for a Russian audience who live under those laws, you can't simply port everything that he says to your home jurisdiction. Personally, I would say that if you live anywhere in the United States, that you should run, not walk, to Andrew Branca's book, The Law of Self-Defense, which is free. And it's not the kind of like freebie that really is just a thinly disguised advertisement. No, it is a meaty book. Branca also offers other classes and products, but the book is a very, very solid value. So if Samoilov's book is the next book on your reading list, then I'd recommend that your very next book after that be Branca's book on the laws of self-defense, or whatever the equivalent might be in your jurisdiction. Friends, this has been a great rambling episode that probably told you more than you really wanted to know about the interior design genius of W.E. Fairbairn's really monumental Anglo-Chinese gutter fighting system, as explicated by Dmitry Samoilov, whose book, once again, is The Mind is the Final Weapon, a scientific view of the Fairbairn system, which you can pick up over at Amazon Kindle. Yes, I am the editor, but any proceeds will go to help kids. However, this course remains free to all the world's workers, soldiers, peasants, and anti-Gestapo operatives. I can't wait to talk to you next time.